The metallic screech of twisted aluminum pierced the Pacific dawn as Lieutenant Jake Morrison watched his wingman's P-38 Lightning disintegrate at 20,000 feet. December 7, 1943, somewhere over the Solomon Islands, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, and the war had followed him into the cockpit of his own fighter, where death rode as his constant co-pilot. Morrison's hands trembled against the control yoke, not from the bitter cold seeping through his flight suit, but from the weight of what he just witnessed. Tommy Chen's aircraft had simply come apart, wings folding like paper, fuselage snapping in half, pieces spinning toward the jungle canopy below in a grotesque ballet of metal and flame. No enemy fire, no mechanical failure warning, just catastrophic structural collapse. The radio crackled with panicked voices from the squadron, but Morrison barely heard them. His mind raced back to 3 weeks ago, to the heated argument in the maintenance hangar. Chief Engineer Sarah Walsh had stood before Colonel Briggs, her face flushed with desperate conviction, pointing at stress fracture reports that everyone else had dismissed. "These modifications are killing our pilots," she'd insisted, her voice breaking. "The weight distribution is all wrong. The airframes can't handle the new ordnance loads." Briggs had laughed, actually laughed. "Miss Walsh, we've got a war to win, not pencil pushing to do." Now Tommy was dead, and Morrison could feel his own aircraft shuddering ominously as he banked toward home base. The same modifications, the same ignored warnings, the same inevitable outcome waiting in the aluminum bones of every P-38 in the squadron. Something was terribly deliberately wrong, and Morrison was beginning to suspect it went far deeper than simple bureaucratic negligence. 3 weeks earlier, Morrison had been a different man, cocky, unquestioning, drunk on the mythology of American air superiority. He'd stood in the briefing room, watching Sarah Walsh's presentation with the casual indifference of someone who'd never seen a friend die screaming in a metal coffin. Walsh had been methodical, her engineer's mind dissecting each failure with surgical precision. The P-38J modifications add 400 pounds of armor plating, but the wing spars weren't reinforced to compensate. "We're asking these airframes to carry loads they were never designed for." Her hands had shaken slightly as she'd pointed to photographs of hairline cracks, stress concentrations that looked like spider webs spreading through vital structural components. Morrison remembered the way Colonel Briggs had dismissed her with a wave of his manicured hand, hands that had never gripped a control stick in combat, never felt the soul-crushing G-forces of a high-speed dive. The flashback shattered as Morrison's radio exploded with static. "Phoenix Leader, this is Tower. You're cleared for emergency landing. Medical teams standing by." Standing by for what, Morrison wondered. For the pieces of Tommy Chen they'd never find. For the explanation they'd never give to his parents in Seattle. As Morrison approached the airfield, he could see Walsh's small figure standing beside the runway, her red hair whipping in the prop wash from other returning aircraft. Even from 1,000 feet, he could read the terrible vindication in her posture, the burden of being right about something so catastrophically wrong. "Hey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our community around the world." The landing gear touched down with a jarring impact that reminded Morrison of his own mortality. As he taxied toward the hangar, he caught sight of Colonel Briggs through the tower window, already on the phone, already spinning the narrative, already burying the truth under layers of military bureaucracy and classified reports. Morrison killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, staring at his hands.
They belong to someone else now. Someone who'd watched preventable death unfold. Someone who'd have to live with the weight of ignored warnings and administrative cowardice. The canopy slid back, and Walsh was there, her face streaked with tears and rage. "How many more, Jake?" she whispered. "How many more before someone listens?" Morrison climbed down from the cockpit, his legs unsteady. For the first time in his military career, he didn't have an answer that felt like anything other than a lie. The maintenance hangar at 0200 hours felt like a cathedral of conspiracy, shadows dancing between the skeletal frames of grounded P-38s. Morrison found Walsh crouched beneath the wing of his own aircraft, a flashlight beam illuminating stress fractures that looked like lightning frozen in metal. "They're all compromised," she whispered without looking up. "Every single bird that's been through the modification program. The cracks propagate faster than I calculated." Morrison knelt beside her, studying the hairline fractures that spiderwebbed through the wing root attachment points. "How long before total structural failure?" "Depends on flight hours, G-forces, combat stress." Walsh's voice carried the flat precision of someone delivering a death sentence. "Some might last 50 missions. Others—" She gestured toward the empty hardstand where Tommy's P-38 had been parked that morning. "Others don't make it back from their first sortie after modification." The hangar door creaked, and both of them froze. Footsteps echoed across the concrete floor, measured, deliberate, military. Morrison recognized the gate before he saw the figure. Master Sergeant Rico Valdez, the squadron's most experienced crew chief, a man whose hands had kept more pilots alive than any medal could honor. "Thought I might find you two here," Valdez said, his weathered face grim in the flashlight's glow. "Got something you need to see." He led them to his private office, a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and engine oil. From a locked drawer, he produced a manila folder thick with photographs and technical reports. Been documenting the modifications for 3 months, every stress test that got buried, every safety recommendation that got ignored. Morrison opened the folder, his blood chilling as he scanned the contents. Falsified inspection reports signed by Briggs. Modified stress test results that had been altered to show acceptable safety margins. Purchase orders for substandard materials approved despite Walsh's written objections. "This isn't negligence," Morrison breathed. "This is deliberate." Walsh's face had gone pale. "Rico, where did you get these?" "Let's just say not everyone in the supply chain is blind to what's happening." Valdez lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "Word is Briggs is getting kickbacks from defense contractors for approving inferior components. Every pilot who dies makes someone back stateside a little richer." The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. Tommy Chen hadn't died because of bureaucratic incompetence. He'd been murdered by a system that valued profit over human life. The American dream twisted into a nightmare where patriotic duty became corporate greed. "We have to expose this," Morrison said. But even as the words left his mouth, he understood the impossible position they faced. Challenging Briggs meant challenging the entire military hierarchy, risking court-martial for insubordination, destroying careers that had become their identities. If this story is hitting you hard, please subscribe and hit that like button to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support keeps these important stories alive. Walsh stood abruptly, pacing the small office like a caged animal. "They'll bury us, transfer us to different theaters, different commands, discredit our findings, destroy our reputations." "Maybe," Valdez said quietly, "but how many more Tommy Chens die while we protect ourselves?" The question hung in the air like smoke from Valdez's cigarette. Morrison thought of Mary Catherine's letters, of the future they'd planned, of the comfortable silence he could choose by simply looking the other way. Then he thought of Tommy's parents in Seattle, staring at a flag-draped coffin and believing their son had died a hero's death. "There's something else," Valdez continued, pulling out a single photograph. It showed Colonel Briggs shaking hands with a man in an expensive civilian suit, both of them standing beside a crate marked with the defense contractor's logo. This was taken last week at the supply depot. Morrison studied the photograph, memorizing every detail. The man's face, the timestamp, the setting that proved Briggs' direct involvement in the conspiracy. Evidence that could save lives or destroy their own.
"I'm in," Morrison said finally, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Whatever it takes."
Walsh nodded, her engineer's mind already working through the logistics. "We'll need more evidence, documented proof of the relationship between the modifications and structural failures, testimony from other pilots who've experienced problems." "And we'll need to move fast," Valdez added. "Word is there's another batch of modifications scheduled for next week, 40 more aircraft." 40 more potential death traps. 40 more pilots who trusted their country to give them tools of war, not instruments of execution. Morrison felt something fundamental shift inside him, the transformation from soldier to rebel, from patriot to revolutionary. The war had followed him home after all, but now he understood that sometimes the enemy wore the same uniform. The briefing at 0600 hours felt like a funeral march. 42 P-38 Lightning sat on the tarmac, their newly modified frames gleaming with morning dew and the promise of catastrophic failure. Morrison sat in the front row, watching Colonel Briggs gesture at tactical maps with the casual confidence of someone who'd never have to test his own theories at 25,000 feet. "Gentlemen, today we demonstrate American air superiority," Briggs announced, his chest puffed with borrowed valor. "The new modifications give us unprecedented firepower and protection. The Japanese won't know what hit them." Morrison caught Walsh's eye from across the briefing room. She'd managed to slip him a hastily scrawled note during the pre-flight inspection. "Wing route stress at critical threshold. Multiple aircraft showing propagation patterns. This is it, Jake." As the pilots filed out toward their aircraft, Morrison felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on him. He could ground himself with a fabricated mechanical issue, save his own life while watching his squadron mates fly to their deaths. He could attempt to warn them all, triggering a panic that would result in court-martial and the burial of all evidence. Or he could fly the mission, hoping to gather irrefutable proof of the conspiracy while risking his own life in the process. Lieutenant Bobby Kruger, barely 19 and fresh from flight school in Texas, fell into step beside him. "You nervous about the new mods, Morrison? My bird feels different during taxi tests, heavier somehow." Morrison's throat tightened. Kruger reminded him of himself 3 years ago, eager, trusting, believing that American engineering was infallible. "Just fly smooth today, Bobby. No unnecessary stress on the airframe." "Roger that, sir." The takeoff sequence proceeded normally until Aircraft 7, piloted by Captain Mike Sullivan, a veteran with 127 combat missions, reported control problems during initial climb. Morrison watched through his canopy as Sullivan's P-38 began to shudder, the twin booms oscillating in a way that made his stomach clench with recognition. "Phoenix 7, you're showing abnormal flight characteristics. Copy, Tower. Left wing feels like it's coming apart, requesting immediate return to..." The transmission cut off as Sullivan's aircraft disintegrated exactly as Tommy Chen's had 3 weeks earlier. Left wing folded upward, then the entire fuselage snapped amidships, pieces tumbling toward the ocean in a shower of aluminum and aviation fuel. No parachute, no time for ejection, just instantaneous death for a man who'd survived over 100 combat missions only to be killed by his own government's corruption. The radio exploded with panicked voices as other pilots reported similar control problems. Morrison keyed his microphone, his voice cutting through the chaos. "All aircraft, this is Phoenix Leader. Reduce power to minimum cruise settings. Avoid any aggressive maneuvering. We have a critical structural problem." "Phoenix Leader, you are not authorized to modify mission parameters," came Briggs's voice from the tower, sharp with barely concealed panic. Morrison ignored him, banking gently toward the formation of B-25 bombers they were supposed to escort. Around him he could see other P-38s struggling with control issues, wings flexing unnaturally, pilots fighting aircraft that seemed determined to tear themselves apart. Then he saw it. Lieutenant Kruger's aircraft, number 12, beginning the same death spiral that had claimed Sullivan. The young pilot's voice crackled through the radio, high with terror. "Phoenix Leader, I can't control her. The stick's gone dead and I'm losing altitude fast." Morrison dove toward Kruger's position, knowing he was risking his own structural integrity but unable to watch another preventable death. "Bobby, try to maintain wings level attitude."
"Don't fight the aircraft. Let her fly herself." But even as he spoke, Morrison could see the stress fractures propagating along Kruger's wing roots, the metal literally peeling apart under loads it was never designed to handle. The boy from Texas had maybe 30 seconds before total structural failure. "Jake?" Kruger's voice had gone small, childlike. "Tell my mom I wasn't scared, okay?" The words hit Morrison like physical blows. He keyed his microphone for a reply, but Kruger's P-38 came apart before he could speak, wings separating from fuselage, the cockpit tumbling end over end toward the Pacific, taking with it a 19-year-old's dreams and his mother's heart. Morrison pulled back on his own controls, feeling his aircraft groan in protest, knowing that every maneuver brought him closer to the same fate. Around him, the surviving pilots struggled to maintain formation, while their aircraft disintegrated piece by piece. Aerial demonstration of American engineering failure and bureaucratic murder. As he leveled off, Morrison made a decision that would haunt him forever. He began photographing the wreckage with his personal camera, documenting each structural failure, each preventable death, gathering evidence that would either save future pilots or destroy his own life. The conspiracy had claimed 4 aircraft and 4 lives in less than 10 minutes. But now Morrison had proof, written in twisted aluminum and pilot blood across the Pacific sky. The debriefing room felt like a morgue, fluorescent lights humming overhead, while 4 empty chairs stood as silent testimony to the day's preventable slaughter. Morrison sat at the metal table, his flight suit still reeking of aviation fuel and fear, watching Colonel Briggs pace behind a podium like a defense attorney preparing to argue an unwinnable case. "Gentlemen, what happened today was an unfortunate confluence of combat stress and extreme weather conditions," Briggs began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who'd spent years perfecting lies. "Preliminary investigations suggest wind shear and pilot error contributed to the structural failures." Morrison's jaw clenched. He'd watched Mike Sullivan, a pilot with more combat experience than Briggs had total flight time, struggle with an aircraft that was literally tearing itself apart. There had been no wind shear, no pilot error, only the inevitable result of criminal negligence disguised as patriotic duty. Walsh sat in the back row, her face a mask of professional composure that barely concealed volcanic rage. She'd spent the afternoon examining wreckage, photographing stress patterns, documenting evidence that would either expose the conspiracy or disappear into classified files where truth went to die. "Sir, with respect," Morrison said, rising from his chair. "I observed the structural failures firsthand. These weren't pilot error incidents. The wing root attachments failed under normal flight loads." Briggs's eyes narrowed. "Lieutenant Morrison, you're speaking from emotional trauma. It's natural to look for explanations when good men die, but speculation isn't helpful." "Speculation?" Morrison pulled out his personal camera, the film containing photographs that could destroy careers or save lives. "I documented everything, sir. Multiple aircraft showing identical failure patterns at the exact stress points Engineer Walsh identified 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, a charged pause before inevitable destruction. Walsh stood slowly, her engineer's mind cutting through diplomatic niceties to reach bedrock truth. "Colonel, I've completed preliminary analysis of the wreckage. The failure modes are consistent with metal fatigue accelerated by improper load distribution. The modifications exceeded safe operational parameters by a factor of nearly 3. Her voice carried the deadly precision of mathematical certainty. "This wasn't an accident. This was predictable, preventable, and criminally negligent." Briggs's facade cracked, revealing the cornered desperation beneath. "Miss Walsh, you're overstepping your authority. This investigation will be conducted by qualified personnel, not by the people who caused it," Morrison interrupted. "Sir, how much money were you paid to approve those modifications?"
The accusation hung in the air like coordinate smoke. Morrison watched Briggs's face cycle through expressions: surprise, rage, calculation, and finally a cold malevolence that confirmed every suspicion. Lieutenant Morrison, you're relieved of duty pending psychological evaluation. Your recent combat stress has obviously affected your judgment. Briggs turned to the other surviving pilots. This debriefing is classified.
Anyone who discusses today's events outside official channels will face court-martial for compromising national security. But Morrison had anticipated this response. During the flight back to base, he'd made radio contact with Captain David Chen, Tommy's older brother, stationed at Pearl Harbor with Naval Intelligence. The photographs were already en route to investigators who couldn't be bought, evidence that would either expose the conspiracy or ensure Morrison's permanent disappearance. Master Sergeant Valdez stood from the back of the room, his weathered face granite hard with resolution. "Colonel, I've been maintaining aircraft for 15 years. I know what combat damage looks like, and I know what criminal negligence looks like. Today was criminal negligence." "Sergeant Valdez, I'm tired of watching good pilots die so defense contractors can buy bigger houses," Valdez continued, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd never compromised his integrity. "I've documented every falsified inspection report, every substandard component approval, every safety recommendation you've buried. The FBI already has copies." Morrison felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a tectonic change as truth finally broke through layers of institutional corruption. Briggs's carefully constructed facade collapsed completely, revealing a small, desperate man who'd traded American lives for personal profit. "You have no idea what you've done," Briggs whispered, his voice carrying genuine fear for the first time. "This goes beyond what you can imagine. People with real power, real influence." "Good," Walsh said quietly. "Let them all burn." The investigation that followed would expose a conspiracy reaching from Pacific Theater commanders to Washington defense contractors, a network of corruption that had turned American industrial might into a murder machine. 47 P-38 pilots had died from preventable structural failures, their deaths hidden behind classified reports and fabricated accident investigations. Morrison never returned to combat flying. The psychological evaluation that was meant to discredit him instead became a platform for testimony that dismantled an entire criminal network. Walsh received the Medal of Freedom for her engineering courage. Valdez was promoted to Chief Master Sergeant and tasked with implementing new safety protocols across the Pacific Fleet. But victory tasted like ashes in Morrison's mouth. Every morning he woke thinking of Bobby Kruger's mother in Texas, reading a telegram that praised her son's heroic sacrifice while concealing the truth of his murder. Every night he dreamed of aircraft coming apart in midair, of young men dying because their country had forgotten that patriotism meant protecting those who served, not profiting from their deaths. The conspiracy had been exposed, justice served, and lives saved. But 4 good pilots remained dead, their families forever wounded by official lies dressed up as heroic sacrifice. 2 years later, Morrison stood in a cemetery in Seattle, watching rain fall on Tommy Chen's headstone, while his brother David placed fresh flowers beside the carved granite. The inscription read, "Died in service to his country," words that carried new weight now that the truth had emerged from classified shadows. "The families deserve to know," David said quietly, his naval intelligence uniform dark with Pacific Northwest rain. Not the sanitized version, not the hero mythology. They deserved the truth. Morrison nodded, thinking of Bobby Kruger's mother in Texas, who'd traveled from congressional hearing where she'd looked Colonel Briggs in the eye and forgiven him, a grace that had broken something fundamental in Morrison's understanding of human nature. Some wounds could heal, even when justice felt insufficient. Walsh that rebuilt her career designing safety systems that made aircraft failure nearly impossible.
her engineering conscience forever scarred but ultimately vindicated. Valdez continued training mechanics to recognize the difference between acceptable risk and criminal negligence. The P-38 modification program had been completely restructured, new protocols implemented that prioritized pilot safety over contractor profits. But the larger truth remained. In wartime, when national survival seemed to justify any sacrifice, ordinary corruption could masquerade as patriotic duty. The conspiracy had been exposed, justice served, and lives saved, but 4 good pilots remained dead, their families forever wounded by official lies dressed up as heroic sacrifice. 2 years later, Morrison stood in a cemetery in Seattle, watching rain fall on Tommy Chen's headstone, while his brother David placed fresh flowers beside the carved granite. The inscription read, "Died in service to his country," words that carried new weight now that the truth had emerged from classified shadows. "The families deserve to know," David said quietly, his naval intelligence uniform dark with Pacific Northwest rain. Not the sanitized version, not the hero mythology. They deserved the truth. Morrison nodded, thinking of Bobby Kruger's mother in Texas, who'd traveled from congressional hearing where she'd looked Colonel Briggs in the eye and forgiven him, a grace that had broken something fundamental in Morrison's understanding of human nature. Some wounds could heal, even when justice felt insufficient. Walsh had rebuilt her career designing safety systems that made aircraft failure nearly impossible, her engineering conscience forever scarred but ultimately vindicated. Valdez continued training mechanics to recognize the difference between acceptable risk and criminal negligence. The P-38 modification program had been completely restructured, new protocols implemented that prioritized pilot safety over contractor profits. But the larger truth remained. In wartime, when national survival seemed to justify any sacrifice, ordinary corruption could masquerade as patriotic duty. The conspiracy had been exposed, the perpetrators prosecuted, the system reformed. Yet Morrison understood that vigilance was the eternal price of preventing such betrayals from recurring. As he walked away from the cemetery, Morrison carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in foreign skies against enemy aircraft, but in American hangars against American corruption.
The war had taught him that courage meant more than flying into combat. It meant standing up to institutional power when institutional power betrayed the people it was meant to protect. The rain continued falling on headstones that marked not just individual deaths, but the cost of forgetting that in a democracy, those who serve deserve more than hollow rhetoric about honor and sacrifice. They deserve leaders who understand that true patriotism means protecting the protectors, not exploiting their dedication for personal gain. If stories like this resonate with you, tales of ordinary courage confronting institutional corruption, then subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's hidden truths. Hit that notification bell and join our community of viewers who believe that understanding the past helps us navigate the present. What other untold stories from history would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments. And remember, the most important history lessons often come from the stories they tried to bury.